Hey, this is Sarah. Look, I'm standing out front of AMPM right now, and well, you're sweet and all, but I found something more fulfilling, even kind of cheesy, but I like it. Sure, you met some of my dietary needs, but they've just got it all. So farewell, oatmeal. So long, you strange, soggy
Break up with bland breakfast and taste AMPM's Bacon, Egg, and Cheese Biscuit, made with cage-free egg, smoked bacon, and melty cheese on a buttery biscuit. AMPM, too much good stuff.
Howdy, everybody. Welcome back to the Conspiracy Farm. Today, we're going to talk about race. Because running a podcast is a lot like being in prison. You've got to pick a fight your first day. Get it over with. Show people who you are. So today, we're going to talk about white people. Where do they come from? What are they? Is this episode going to get me canceled? Maybe. But everything we're talking about today happened thousands of years ago. We're going to talk about real, actual goths, creepy druids, warriors fighting battles in the nude, human sacrifice, and my very own DNA test results. Where do I come from? Turns out, 2 mutants, just like everybody else. Hopefully everybody gets the joke. White people are mutants, but only in the same way that any other organism is. Genetics doesn't quite work like the X-Men comics, where a mutation means something catastrophic like you suddenly grow wings or have superpowers. Most mutations aren't even noticed, and they crop up with surprising regularity. It's an inevitable thing in biology, and over time you can actually track changes between species by timing the rate of new mutations. The average child has a few hundred point mutations. And that means that in their DNA, there are a few hundred A's, T's, C's, or G's that are different and that didn't come from either parent. So being a mutant doesn't mean you're abnormal. It means you're an organism. I did professional editing for 10 years, mostly for academic papers before submission to peer-reviewed journals. And to do this job, you have to know the APA rules and the Chicago Manual of Style. I'm actually using the correct preferred terms here, believe it or not. The preferred term in academic papers is white and not Caucasian. Likewise, the current preferred term is black and not African American. The important thing is that you capitalize both words to signify the fact that white and black are not literal descriptions of skin, but rather social categories of people. The whole concept of a race is absurdly fuzzy. It's one of those words that is useless outside of poetry. I think my job here is a lot simpler because I only have to define one race. I think that different quote-unquote races would have different definitions. What we call quote-unquote white today generally refers to light-skinned humans of European ancestry. In particular, we're talking about blue-eyed blonde people, but not exclusively. One thing we can immediately notice in these genetic differences is that we have characteristics that cluster around a specific thing, and that is the regulation of pigment proteins, melanin in particular. It's just a protein that absorbs light, and the human body does not produce a blue pigment of any kind. Veins looking blue and eyes looking blue are a trick of color perception and light diffraction. This means that a very simple random mutation can change hair and eye and skin color just by breaking. It doesn't have to do anything special. Just by not doing something, it can change the pigment pattern in the organism in question. There are apparently lots of genes that can change eye color. It looks like the picture is a lot more complicated than that Punnett square that people learn in biology courses. These eye color genes control the production of melanin in the eye. A lot of melanin means brown, almost no melanin means blue. Now, why are all these little pigment regulation proteins breaking? The earliest humans were a dark grayish tan with brown hair, brown eyes. Both white people and black people are more recent developments. Once these original grayish tan people ventured into a place with very little sun over thousands of years, the people with lighter skin had a slight advantage. This is because humans need sunlight to metabolize vitamin D, and these were not people that lived mostly naked in the sun like we did in Eastern Africa. So the less skin pigment you have, the better. The genome is a big, clunky messy, overcomplicated machine, and a lot of genes are connected in ways that you wouldn't expect them to be. And so genes that control pigment in the iris have some effect on skin pigmentation and vice versa. And all of this made sense chemically 100 million years ago, but not so much now. Who were the first people in Europe? We know that very early on Neanderthals lived in Europe, but they were the first examples of the Homo sapiens species in Europe, although they were another subspecies. They also had blue eyes, freckles, red hair, but this appeared to be a separate mutation track from what humans followed. In other words, humans with blue eyes do not have blue eyes because of any relationship to Neanderthals. Although it is true that there appears to have been some interbreeding between early modern humans and Neanderthals. However, that does not explain the origin of blue eyes in humans, as we'll see. Now, blue-eyed modern humans were not the first modern humans in Europe, not by a long shot. The first blue-eyed people that we know of on Earth appeared around 6000 BC. And notice I don't say CE or BCE. You're supposed to say those instead of AD and BC. I have my reasons, and we'll talk more on that later. I'll give you a hint. They are more logical issues than theological issues. This Aboriginal population is represented now only in the Basques and to some extent the Welsh. So 2,000 years before blue-eyed people appear, these medium light-skinned, brown-eyed, brown-haired people settled in Europe around 8000 BC, and these people likely gradually flowed in from Southwest Asia. These people were farmers. They were not big hunters or horse riders. They didn't seek to control large territory. They appeared to be great at farming and great at working with stone. The leading theory is that this is the culture that built Stonehenge, not the Celts. As we'll see, the Celts probably would have made it a lot prettier. So you have these plain living, brown-eyed, Aboriginal European farmer stonemason priests living in relative peace for about 4,000 years. And then came the mutants from the Caucasus. Okay, let's get my ancestry out of the way. In terms of genetics, where do I come from? Well, I took a DNA test several years ago, and it looks like I'm just a good representative specimen of generic Western Hemisphere human. The results of the DNA test matched family history, and we'll go from order of smallest percentage to largest. Starting out, we have 15% Nigerian. Now, based on family tradition, this looks like about 7.5% through my mother's mother, and about half through my mother's father. Next, we have 25% North American native, and that's going to refer, no doubt, to the Haida tribe. It's a Native American tribe based in southern Alaska. The way I describe it is these are the totem pole building tribes. Next is 25% Ireland, Scotland, Wales. There is my first connection to whiteness. We're definitely talking something Celtic here. However, it's either Scottish or Scots-Irish, which would include some Germanic groups. In that part of the family, you find names like Albritton or Barrow, which are pretty solid English names. Then last but not least, in fact, the most, is 35% Scandinavian. And so now, despite my French last name, I found out that I'm 0% French. The explanation appears to be that LeCornu is a Norman French name, and the Normans were essentially Vikings that settled on the northern coast of France and lived there because the French king had no ability to force them to leave. So there you have it, folks. The big reveal. I'm 60% mutant from the Caucasus. So the first blue-eyed people appear around 6000 BC north of the Caucasus Mountains. There are definite mentions of people called the Scythians, and they dominated what's now Ukraine. These were horse-riding people from the Eurasian steppe. Pale skin, blue eyes, blonde or red hair. They herded cattle. They even used horses for dairy, which you don't always see. The Mongolians have a traditional dish that's based on mare's milk. This reliance on dairy for their calories would change them genetically in terms of how their teeth formed and also their ability to digest milk well into adulthood. Because it turns out that every mammal can digest lactose normally because lactose is a common element in mammals' milk. So children need that to get their calories so they can grow. However, there's a timer on that gene, and around age 2, it normally turns off. So what we call lactose tolerance is just having a mutation that keeps that gene on until much, much later in life. And so you produce the lactase enzyme that helps you digest lactose, and you get more calories out of milk, and you also have fewer digestive issues. So the history of Caucasian people and the history of lactose-tolerant people go hand in hand. Now, who would have guessed that this is more complicated than you might think? I've tried to boil it down to 4 major groups that comprise what I would call whiteness. Each one of these has been considered white at different levels at different times. And the categorization can be as much cultural as genetic. As I mentioned earlier, that's one of the frustrations with dealing with ethnicity. For example, Finnish people from Finland are often considered white, even though they are a genetic isolate that appears to be a fusion of the Aboriginal European group and an Asiatic group from North Central Asia. I would say the best example of this Mediterranean type would be Utsi. He was a man that researchers found buried under snow in the Alps, and he died there in 3000 BC. This is after the invasion of the Caucasians, so people like Utsi lived in the aftermath of that collision. The modern population that most closely matches Utsis would be the island of Corsica. And the island of Corsica is in, guess where, the Mediterranean. Definitely in the modern world and even in the Middle Ages, the Mediterranean was just an exhausting patchwork of ethnicities that mingled and colonized and conquered every square inch of the place. The Romans themselves claim that they're from what's now Turkey, not Europe. Historians still can't agree on where the Etruscans came from, and they dominated North Italy throughout the Bronze Age. So remember, when I talk about Mediterranean types, I'm talking about a group of people that really only existed in antiquity. Now, what about the Slavic groups? Slavic people are cousins of the Germans. They came out of Central Asia later. We're going to focus on Celts and the Germanic tribes because, A, everyone's probably sick of hearing me drone on about Mediterranean people, the Greeks and the Romans. And Slavic people did not migrate far enough west until the early Middle Ages. A bit out of my wheelhouse. It's a fascinating and important story, and there are people out there who can tell the story much better than I can. But just know going into this that Slavic people are definitely also descendants primarily of these early Caucasians, but they're descended from the ones that wandered farther north and east into Asia. Okay, moving on to the Celts. This is a famous term. I think we've all heard about the Celts. There's some confusion as to whether to pronounce the word with a hard C or a soft C, because of course there's the Boston Celtics. No one, as far as I know, says Boston Celtics. But the original word was a hard C. And the interesting thing is that we know how the Celts pronounced their own name because they wrote their own language down phonetically using Greek letters. And so the Greeks simply borrowed their spelling, which borrowed their pronunciation. And they used the Greek letter that looks like a K. Keltoi was what they called them. And yes, we couldn't avoid talking about the ancient Greeks for a little bit there, only because at the time they were writing down the most stuff. The Keltoi were first mentioned by a Greek geographer named Hecataios in 517 BC. He was using that word to describe a group of people that were living near Massilia in southern France. It's what's now Marseille. So here we have a Greek geographer educating people about Celts living on the coast of southern France. Then later on in the 400s BC, Herodotus talked about Celts living along the source of the Danube in far west Europe. And so this shows that the Celts were all over the place. We generally think of Ireland when we think of Celtic culture, and of course the Celts were living in Ireland, but there were heavily populated Celtic regions stretching all the way from Ireland across Europe through the Balkans and to the coast of the Black Sea, and then all the way into what's now Turkey. So notice the interesting picture of Europe that's being painted here. So we're in the 400s BC, and we're being told that we have these Celtic groups living in what's now Germany, Austria, Hungary, and the Balkans. We're a long way from Ireland, and this is a strong hint that the Germanic peoples were not in Europe yet. If you're wondering why Celts could settle in Austria, it's because there were no Austrians there yet. There were no German-speaking people anywhere within 1,000 miles. The Slavic peoples were not in Europe yet. There were no Poles in Poland, no Czechs in Czechia, no Hungarians in Hungary, no Turks in Turkey. These were all developments that occurred in the Middle Ages. I think we may have all heard of a book of the New Testament called the Epistle to the Church at Galatia, or Galatia. Galatia was a majority Celtic city in what's now Turkey. It sort of marks off the far eastern frontier of the Celtic world. But you can see that any culture that spans from Ireland to Spain to Italy to the Balkans to Turkey to Eastern Europe to Germany to Britain is a culture that at one point encompassed everything we know about as being Europe today. At the time when Greek power dissolved in the Eastern Mediterranean in the mid-300s, Rome wasn't strong enough to take advantage of that power vacuum. But there was someone who was. The Macedonians. You've probably heard of the Macedonians before, most likely in connection with some guy named Alexander. Alexander the Great was a Macedonian king of the late 300s. Now, why am I mentioning the Macedonians? They are of some interest to this subject. They spoke a dialect of Greek, but they were from farther up into the Balkan Peninsula, north of where the other Greek-speaking people lived. Now, north of Greece, up into the Balkans, that should ring a bell. Herodotus told us there were blue-eyed people up there. Also, note that the Macedonians were not primarily farmers, but rather herdsmen and horsemen. Also, blonde hair and blue eyes were much more prevalent in that population. Alexander had blonde hair, so it seems to me that the Macedonians were mutants from the Caucasus. So you can see that the Macedonians appeared to have been a collision between the more northern Celtic groups and the Aboriginal and Mediterranean groups. The Celts had been there for a long time. So when the Visigoths sacked Rome in 410 AD, people of Celtic ancestry were probably thinking, well, we did that 800 years ago, losers. Now, what was the relationship between the Aboriginal Europeans and the blue-eyed invaders from the east? Well, multiple Roman writers talk about the strict class structure of the Celts. They noted that the nobles and the druids appeared to be primarily descendants of the eastern invaders, while the lower classes were primarily descendants of the Aboriginal people. And so notice early on in Western civilization, you have this bifurcation or this dual layer of society where people at the top don't farm, they ride horses, and they fight, and they administrate, where people at the bottom have no power and all they do is farm, and they probably have never ridden a horse or touched a sword. This pattern would continue up through the modern period. And it's interesting to think about how that pattern was established in prehistory during wars that we'll never know the details of. I'm sure that there were great Celtic princes and warriors and kings who worked to secure this conquest, but their names are lost to history now. Okay, so we've been talking about 1000 BC when the Celts first came into Europe. Then we talked about 500 BC when the Greeks first started writing about them because they appeared to be everywhere. Now let's zoom forward to Caesar's time. This is 1,000 years after the Celts first entered Europe. By the 1st century, Roman geographers had classified what is now France and parts of northern Italy as Gallia, later became pronounced Gaul, Gaul. And famously, Caesar fought to conquer Gaul because, as we'll see, it was a very nice place. It wasn't the scary wild forest that Germania was, or Germany. And the Celts themselves were not as rustic or uncouth as they're portrayed in movies. Sometimes they have the Celts almost howling at the moon, painted white or blue, scaring someone with a spear. That's not the image we get when we look at the ancient writers themselves. Now, it's very convenient for us that so many good Roman sources were in Gaul or wrote extensively about Gaul, because Gaul is a great representative of the Celtic world. These Celts spoke different dialects, but they shared a language family and a loosely connected culture, all the way from Ireland to Turkey. And Gaul was the crossroads of all this. So if you have Celts in Spain and northern Italy, Ireland, Britain, then Eastern Europe and the Balkans, you can see why Gaul, with its great farmland in the south, was the capital of Celtic culture. Like most regions inhabited by the Celts, Gaul was a tame and pastoral place. Celts lived in large wooden houses with thatched roofs, quite different from Romans. A proper Roman house always had ceramic roof tiles. The Celtic houses were distinctive because the walls were made of wicker work, covered with a kind of clay with lime added, so that it made this white cross between adobe and mortar. It's pretty effective. Celts tried to live simply. Apparently they mostly slept on the ground, on mattresses made of straw. The Romans noted how much Celtic women worked in the fields. Of course, a proper Roman woman was supposed to be mending cloaks or spinning yarn indoors. So Gaul had lots of farmland, but it also had a lot of fortified city centers. And some of these were centers of culture and education, not just trading posts. So we're going to listen to a few quotes from Julius Caesar himself. Caesar did live and travel around in Gaul for 8 years during his campaign. But still, I don't think anyone should take Caesar at his word about anything. Caesar is a politician through and through, not a historian. So what do you know? In Caesar's own writings, it turns out that Julius Caesar was a strategic genius, a philanthropist, just an amazing guy. Now, if you read other sources about Caesar, they don't agree. But I guess we'll go ahead and take Caesar at his word and assume he was an amazing guy. So let's hear what he has to say about Gaul.
Gaul is heavily populated and heavily cultivated. No natural resource is untapped. Their women have many children, and they make exceptional mothers. The men are warlike, passionate, and argumentative. They are quick to anger, but very generous in spirit. They are too trusting, which makes them susceptible to deceptive strategies.
So very early on, you can see the stereotype developing that Celtic women can easily have lots of children. A Celtic woman was good for having a large family. Another Roman writer described Celtic women as 3 things: tall, blue-eyed, and very attractive. The same writer also notes that it's dangerous to get into a fight with a Celtic man, but God help you if his wife shows up to help him. He warns us that a Celtic woman with her, quote, huge, snowy arms, end quote, could, quote, strike like catapults, end quote. So we have to imagine these Celtic women with strong arms from working in the fields, taking their part in fights every now and then. But contrary to the scary images in movies, the Celts were known for being a sociable people who loved a good party. Now here's Caesar talking about how much the Celts loved to gossip and talk about their opinions on things.
They were always eager for news, always bothering merchants and travellers for some bit of gossip. They are fond of change, and even fonder of changing their opinions. But they are highly intelligent. They can understand and recreate any machine or device they find useful.
And don't even think for a second that all this talking that the Celts were doing was good old-fashioned Roman-style, plain, down-to-earth, honest words. No, these were the silver-tongued words of Celts. Roman writers talk about the Gauls' propensity for poetry, riddles, and the quote-unquote subtle use of language. Here's another Roman writer, Cato, complaining about the Celtic fondness for poetic metaphors.
They are not a talkative people. They are fond of expressing themselves in enigmas, so the hearer has to read between the lines.
Romans hated reading between the lines. If you read Roman sources, you'll see that they were a bit literal about everything, so I can see why they found this frustrating. I think that what we're seeing here is a Roman reaction to Celts being closed off to outsiders. Maybe they had a vicious social scene where no one wanted to get canceled for saying the wrong things, and so that's why Celts used euphemisms all the time. But I do think that it's mostly just Romans were not welcome in some areas of their cultural life. And as we'll see, secrecy was a big part of Celtic culture. Maybe the subtle use of language developed because in Celtic culture a fist fight could break out at any minute. I mean, according to Romans, those darn Celts are like mindless, raging bulls, you know. At least that's what Polybius thinks. Well, let's listen to him.
They are driven by their passions in everything they do. I don't mean most things. I mean everything. They never submit to logic.
Well, he sounds frustrated. Who hurt you, Polybius? Well, part of this lack of logic that the Romans perceived was an over-reliance or hyper-focus on superstition and divination. Now, we're not sure how much of this is Roman perception and how much of this is actual viable historical information. We know that later on the Romans considered the Christians as hopelessly taken in by an Eastern superstition. But there appears to have been some power in the Celts' religious beliefs because it was universally acknowledged in the ancient world that the Celts didn't fear death, that a Celtic warrior had no fear for his own life and no regard for yours. And so Celtic warriors were seen as more fearless and more cruel. The Romans never forgot that the Celts had sacked Rome back in the day. The Celts were known for being great at fighting, and they did it in style. They looked good doing it. There are descriptions of famous Celtic warriors riding back from battles on their horses with the heads of slain enemies hanging from their saddles. Despite what we would call that bit of barbarism there, the Celts were known for being committed to beauty in everything they did. One way we know the Celts didn't build Stonehenge is that it would have been carved a lot more intricately. We would have had plenty of visual representations for what the stones were for. Celtic warriors were known for ensuring their hair was perfect. They wore very little armor, but they never forgot their gold chains and torques. Going into battle, Celtic warriors wore lots of colors and ornaments. And Polybius here is going to talk about one case in 222 BC where the Celts almost won the battle just by being so gorgeous. Let's listen to this story.
The warriors at the front of the Celtic army stripped naked before the battle, wearing only their beloved golden bracelets and collars gleaming in the sun. The Roman legionnaires were amazed by their height and their pale skin. But still, at the end of the day, their golden ornaments were all shipped back to Rome by the cartload.
Burn. Polybius is cooking. And speaking of Celtic religious beliefs, Caesar writes something interesting about the Druids. Let's hear what he has to say.
Druids are exempt from military service. They pay no taxes. They must memorize a great number of verses. Some study these verses for 20 years. It is forbidden for them to write these verses down. In everyday transactions and accounts, they use Greek letters.
So I think this is fascinating. For ordinary letters, journal entries, receipts, accounting, the Celts used their language. They just wrote it down phonetically using Greek letters. They even had public schools in their towns where they taught this, so literacy was relatively high among the Celts by ancient standards. And of course, we'll always wonder, I suppose, what was in all those verses. Considering they were never written down, it's pretty tantalizing. We know that those verses may relay information that went back thousands of years, but we'll probably never know. I have a personal anecdote that's directly related to this from when I was in Pompeii. I talk about this in the archaeology series, but when I was in the Lupinarium, which was essentially a brothel, I went into one of the rooms where the services were rendered, and I was trying to read some of the graffiti written on the walls, and I got super excited because I spotted some Greek letters. And I knew at the time that even though that territory was ruled by Romans, it would have had a Greek-speaking majority in the city of Naples at the time. There were a lot of quote-unquote Romans who didn't know Latin and only spoke a Celtic language. And we're talking about Italy in the 1st century AD. So it turns out I could not make any sense of those Greek letters, and later I found out why. In the museum in Pompeii, there was a stela that had been excavated, and a stela is basically a standing stone monument. And a lot of times ancient people would put these in town squares and they would inscribe laws on them. And for that purpose, these stelae would have different languages inscribed on different facets. And for this stela from Pompeii, it was inscribed in Oscan. Oscan was a local Celtic dialect. So this is a town just outside of Naples in Italy, very close to Rome, and it had been ruled by Romans for centuries, and Pompeii is famous today as a quote-unquote Roman city, but it was also heavily Celtic. And this shows just how much Celts had intertwined themselves with Greco-Roman society. In the 100s AD, as we're closing in on 200 AD, everything was nice. Everything was hunky-dory. The Romans were running everything. Everything was peaceful. The Celts were integrating, starting to become what we would later call French, although there were some medieval additions and complications to come. But, speaking of complications, a big complication was about to knock on the door of Eastern Europe. And of course I'm talking about our friends the Germans. They were Eastern nomads on the plains of West Central Asia in the 100s AD. But then they started migrating into Europe. Now, what caused this migration? Once again, we're not entirely sure, but it appears to be activity in Central and East Asia that was displacing the Western nomads in Asia. It appears that this push from Central Asia would continue because by the 100s you had Germans arriving in Eastern Europe. By the 400s you had the Huns, which were from farther into Asia. Now you'll notice that sometimes I use the word German or Germans, but I often use Germanic or Germanic tribes. That's just an attempt to be accurate because Germany wasn't even remotely a country until the 1800s. The idea of a German nation state with a unified German identity was a very new and strange idea. As we'll see, part of this lack of centralization and lack of unity was a hallmark of Germanic culture. So these Germanic tribes were not politically united at all. There were some treaties and confederacies between Germanic groups later on, but the Germanic tribes did share closely related languages and closely related cultural beliefs. All these Germanic groups worshipped some form of Odin and Thor and Freya, but a central home, a connection to land, is something that the Germans had not had up to that point in their entire culture. But strangely enough, they eventually did settle permanently in Europe, and their descendants are still there. And where are they now? The descendants of the Germans are primarily in what's now all the Scandinavian countries, from Iceland to Denmark to Sweden, Norway, but not Finland, as we've talked about. Then there's Germany, of course, the Netherlands, Belgium. But then note that England and France have a history that's heavily influenced by both Celtic and Germanic. In fact, I would argue that the relative success of England and France politically in the early modern period might be connected to the complications that they had to overcome with the cultural conflicts in their societies, because they were uniting disparate groups that didn't see themselves as being one race or one culture. So the strange thing is that modern England benefited from the diversity of its past. And a lot of times people don't think of medieval England as a diverse place, but it was. I would say that when person A wants to set person B on fire and burn them to death publicly, I would say that that is a pretty extreme difference of opinion. And just the fact that everyone had the same skin color doesn't make it any less of an extreme difference of opinion. Now, one of these Germanic groups became famous later on, only in name. People are generally not familiar with who they were historically. But now I'm talking about Goths, the actual real Goths. The original Goths, the OGs. By the 300s AD, the Goths ruled all the territory from the Balkans through Ukraine. Once again, they were pushed out of Central Asia by the Huns, who would keep moving west, by the way, and the Huns would also themselves spill into Europe in the 400s. Well, the Goths were not one political group. As usual with the Germanic tribes, they kept splitting and joining into these free-flowing factions. The Gothic factions settled into different regions of Western Europe and North Italy especially. In the 500s AD, there were regions in North Italy that were ruled by Gothic kings, in particular the Ostrogoths. And this was a major cultural clash, and what we'll see is what really created the Middle Ages was really the transition from a more Latin-dominated European culture to a Germanic-dominated culture. And in both cases, the Celts played both sides in between. So we can see the Germans were late to the game, but they came in strong. Our first big source of information on the Germans doesn't come from Herodotus in the 400s BC. That's way too early. The writer we're going to listen to next is Tacitus. He was the first Greco-Roman writer to talk about the Germans. He's writing this 1,000 years after the Celts had already been in Europe. And so you'll see the Romans were shocked with some of the cultural practices that the Germans had brought in from their harsh environment in Asia. When you think of Tacitus, think of the movie Gladiator. You don't have to remember the plot. Just remember that Tacitus lived roughly the same time as our hero Maximus Decimus Meridius, and he wrote at roughly the same time about the same people. You'll see that the essential character of the Germanic people, as described by Tacitus, is different from the ancient perception of the Celts. We saw the Romans talk about this sort of exuberance and aesthetic concern of the Celts, and that is a strong contrast from what we'll see from Tacitus. He talks about a very stoic and ferocious society. The irony here is that Tacitus himself would be considered white today, just like Maximus. And here he is spouting racist stereotypes against people that he perceives as entirely other. And so this is a good example of what we see in history, is that what is considered white now is really just an amalgamation of all these ancestors who saw themselves as entirely different. At no point does Tacitus note that his skin is light and so is the Germans, and so they need to be friends. He's bound up in ideas of class and culture. Okay, so the first thing that Tacitus talks about is the physical appearance of the Germans, which was distinctive. Let's listen.
The Germans are uniquely pure in their breeding. They all look alike. Stern blue eyes and yellow hair, with hulking bodies fit for brief exertion at best. This isolation is to be expected. Who would leave his home and move to Germany? An ugly, gloomy, and crude place with a harsh climate hopeless for farming.
Wow, well that was uncalled for. Even back then, when Germany was 90% forest, I think almost anyone would say it was a beautiful place even back then. I guess we'll have to extend some empathy to Tacitus and say that a person who grows up on the Mediterranean coast probably won't like the weather in Germany. In addition to the harsh weather, the Romans noted that the Germans appeared to be unnecessarily rustic and plain. The Romans saw some connection between the rough and tumble upbringing of Germans, even German nobles, and their eventual size and strength. Let's listen.
The gods have denied them the use of silver or gold. The Germans rejoice only in the number of their cattle. I don't know whether this is a blessing or a curse. In their homes, their children run around filthy and naked. You cannot tell a nobleman from a slave when they are children. This is how they grow those hulking limbs we all wondered to behold.
Well, those hulking limbs were a wonder for the Romans to behold, but they wouldn't be as wondrous by modern standards. So bear in mind that the Germans appeared to be taller than average, but by modern standards, they wouldn't have been considered tall. You did have people that were 6 feet tall around 200 AD, but that would be like being 6'5" now. It's something that happens, but it's something that people notice and talk about. At the time, as far as archaeologists can tell from remains, the average man was about 5'7". So, if a German noble puts his 6-foot-tall warriors all up front, that's going to be pretty impressive to the sons of subsistence farmers. In addition to this reputation for being large and bulky, the Romans also tended to say that the Germans were lazy and violent. Let's listen to this.
They pass the time doing nothing, aside from eating or sleeping. Even their best fighters don't do much. Instead, they let the older men, their wives, and their servants manage their households. I'm amazed at their contradictory nature. These same men who love sitting around all day cannot maintain peace in their land.
Wow. Check your privilege there, Tacitus. It's hard to take a Roman aristocrat seriously when he's talking down to someone about letting women or servants do their work for them, or maintaining peace for that matter. So surely Tacitus is wrong about Germans not doing anything. They had to be doing something. So what were they doing? According to Tacitus, Germans loved to gamble, but they damn sure followed the rules. You got to give them that. Let's hear about it.
I am amazed at how much they love playing dice. They gamble all the time, even when sober. They can gamble so desperately that sometimes, when a man loses all his money, he bets his liberty on a single throw of the dice. When he loses, he calmly volunteers for slavery. However strong he is, he allows the winner to tie him up and sell him. When something terrible happens, they always carry on like nothing happened. They themselves call it honor.
So, is this the origin of the stiff upper lip? In the next clip, Tacitus talks about the Germanic religion. He's going to mention Mercury, and scholars don't agree entirely on why that is. The leading theory is that when the Germans and Romans first interacted and traded stories about their culture, the Germans found commonalities between the characteristics of Mercury and those of Odin. They also connected Thor with Hercules. There's some evidence that the Norse, i.e. the Vikings in the early Middle Ages, associated Thor with Jesus. But that's a story for a later time.
They worship Mercury above all. On certain days, they offer even human sacrifices to him. They find it offensive to hold gods inside walls or represent them as humans. They hold entire forests to be sacred, where they keep sacred white horses. They believe the neighing of these horses can predict the future, similar to how we Romans observe the flight of birds.
One of the things I liked about Gladiator was its more accurate representation of Roman culture. And in one of the first scenes in Gladiator, they show Maximus watching a little bird perched on a bush, and Maximus watches the bird intently, waiting for it to fly away to note what direction it flies. That was a very Roman thing. They believed that birds had some sort of connection to the divine, maybe because they could fly, but Romans were very concerned with the behavior of birds and how that related to the future. So you can see Tacitus, even he realizes that he's going to have a hard time making fun of Germans listening to the neighing of horses when he knows that Romans watched the flights of birds, also paid attention to the behavior of sacred chickens. It was a bit hypocritical and ridiculous the way the Romans went around accusing other cultures of being superstitious. I also think it's interesting that this practice the Germans apparently had of making natural landmarks sacred instead of artificial indoor spaces is reminiscent of Native American culture. and their ideas about the spirit world and how humans are part of the natural world and not in dominion over it. Now, I think it's no accident that they're similar, because I think it's an example of what I would call convergent cultural evolution, where similar environments will create similar cultures. Tacitus and the other Romans realized that the Germans had come from a harsh place, and this led to some harsh practices. But even the Romans, of all people, were shocked at some of the practices of the Germans. Let's listen.
No one jokes about vices there. No one blames corruption on the custom of the age. They prosecute trials in their assemblies. They hang traitors and deserters from trees. They say they do this because disloyalty must be exposed for all to see. People who are guilty of crimes related to cowardice or unnatural behavior are instead drowned in mud under heavy weights. They say they do this because weakness and disgrace must be hidden away.
Well, that got dark. When a Roman aristocrat tells you maybe you should back off, maybe you've gone too far, maybe you should listen, because the Persians were the ones who invented crucifixion. They were the ones who invented this practice of nailing people to crossed poles in stressful positions publicly so that they can slowly suffocate to death under their own body weight. And the Romans saw that and said, good idea. We got to start doing that. So this is the cultural mindset that looked at the Germans' judicial practices and thought, wow, that's extreme. But life wasn't all muddy cruelty and death for the early Germans. Just mostly. They still sometimes fell in love. But if you ever thought that all is fair in love and war, then you better fucking think again. This is Germanic marriage, baby. And there are definite rules. Rules that you follow or people will die. It's that simple. If you don't believe me, let's listen to Tacitus talking about Germanic marriage practices.
The laws surrounding marriage are very strict there. The Germans are monogamous, unlike nearly all other barbarians. Men of very high station will marry multiple women, but only for political purposes. They enforce chastity among themselves. They forbid lewd theatrical diversions and banquets. Adultery is very rare. It is punished instantly. The aggrieved husband cuts all his wife's hair off, strips her naked, and forces her out of the house. Then he publicly whips her in the presence of her family and the entire village.
Okay, that escalated quickly. I think those Germans in particular may have been reading and following the writings of Andreas Tatius, the Roman kickboxer and social media influencer. So, today we did a lot of overthinking about ethnicity. Is it ultimately pointless to put too much thought into race? As we've seen today, entire races of people come and go. Some are wiped out, others are absorbed. Sometimes two completely different ethnicities can fuse to create a brand new one, like Latinos. Where are the Carthaginians or the Etruscans now? I think it's psychologically difficult for humans to give up entirely on race because I think everybody wants to know their origin story. That's what these were like today, the origin stories of ethnic groups that we see today. I think it's a pretty good origin story. May not be as good as Batman's. He has the best origin story, right? This story about the Celts and the Germans isn't very romantic, and it doesn't do what origin stories are really supposed to do. They're supposed to say something about the essential character of the thing that's being originated. By the way, that is a logical fallacy called the genetic fallacy, meaning that if something is the result of A or something comes out of A, then it must be like A in some way. I think the only essential character we could point to in that vein is that the people we call white share ancestry from people who lived in very hostile environments a long time ago. But we see that these people started getting very comfortable as soon as they left that hostile environment. After 1,000 years, the Celts had mellowed out and integrated themselves into Europe so that they weren't even recognizable as the kindred of the Germans, even though they were both mutants from the Caucasus. I think a farmer in the south of France has more cause to be mellow and jolly than a nomadic hunter just southwest of Siberia. So I think Celtic culture is what you would expect from these blue-eyed invaders settling into farming communities and building permanent community centers. They lost their nomadic ways. They started to change into something more like the Aboriginal people that their ancestors had conquered in the first place. And remember that farming wasn't even possible on the steppe. Even if the Germans could somehow cultivate the land, they couldn't defend it long enough to make it worth the effort. The environment was just too unpredictable. And I think the Germans' environment and that extra 1,000 years they spent on the steppe created a culture that was maybe too hyper-focused on hierarchy, which you need for strong leadership in crises. These different genes that cropped up near the Caucasus Mountains weren't some sort of special sauce that created these world-conquering supermen. That's what Hitler thought, but I'm going to go ahead and go out on a limb and disagree with Hitler there. That's what we do on this show. We take bold positions. I think what made the Germans different was that extra 1,000 years on the steppe. It was a cultural evolution thing, not a genetic evolution thing. And cultural evolution is also a good suspect here because cultural evolution works a lot like biological evolution. You have to have diversity, and then circumstances, quote unquote, kill off the memes that it doesn't like. And so the Germans' environment was perfect for this because, as I said earlier, the Germans were just a scattered patchwork of culturally similar tribes. Lots of diversity. Then you have a harsh natural environment combined with constant warfare. This is going to forge a culture that's very effective for surviving hardship and warfare. And then when those hardened people come into Europe and encounter, let's face it, soft, spoiled Romans and Celts who had been enjoying the bounty of Europe for that long, they weren't able to withstand the German pressure. So what connection could this possibly have to our everyday lives now? Well, all of this stuff makes me wonder, how has the physical environment of my more recent ancestors impacted their outlook on life? How do you think your environment has impacted your outlook on life? Some of my earliest full memories were from the 1980s. And I remember as a child starting to form this opinion that, wow, I live in a dog-eat-dog world that's full of bullies, and I better figure out how to make money and take care of myself. I watched movies like Wall Street, Arnold Schwarzenegger movies, and they taught me that money and power is what really matters in the world. When Conan the Barbarian's father, who was a sword maker, shows his son the new sword that he made, and he tells his son that you can't trust anything in the world. You can't trust men, you can't trust women, you can't trust gods. But then he holds up the steel sword and he says, this you can trust. And growing up in Texas, you think to yourself, well, that's similar to a good working rifle. You can always trust that. So did I develop a more cold-blooded, exploitative, capitalist character because of that? I think so. I've noticed that even the grandchildren of farmers will pay a lot of attention to the weather. They'll watch the Weather Channel and talking about unusually high tides in Singapore. But I can see why those habits would develop and would be so strong. Anyone who's been anywhere near the ocean during a storm can understand why sailors would tend to be so superstitious. You feel so powerless. We aren't living on a frozen wasteland now, but I would definitely say that we are living in a hostile environment. Not in physical terms. I think our society is almost perfectly designed to destroy our mental health. Maybe we're a group of tribes that has wandered into an environment that'll make us worse, not better. But maybe I'm just overthinking all this. I'm sure we'll be fine. I don't really see anything on the horizon that would cause a problem. It's going to be smooth sailing from here on. And while you're enjoying this utopia of ours, don't forget about this little podcast. I've got lots more weird stuff to unleash on the world from the frozen tundra of my brain. Talk to you then.